Welcome to Hip Replacement, the podcast that talks about generations X, Y, and Z. I'm your host, Ben Dietz. And this podcast started with my own hip replacement. In fact, two of them. I've spent years in the trenches of the culture industry trying to stay current with what's happening in hip with young people. But when I got my hips replaced, I realized while convalescing that it was not something I could keep up on anymore. So I wanted to form a forum to commune with people in generations Y and Z and just understand what the kids are listening to, so to speak. The first person I reached out to was Kyle Raymond Fitzpatrick, who writes the Trend Report newsletter. He's based in Barcelona, but is an American expat and is maybe the most online person that I know, at least by his output. So, Kyle, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the compliment, and also, I'm very online, which I think is both an asset and a giant cross to bear. But
I wasn't sure how you were going to take that, which is why I wanted to surprise you with it.
It's true. It's a fact.
Well, so, and then in this, our pilot episode, which came out really well if you're hearing it, we are also joined by our Gen Z guest. His name is Campbell Dietz, and as you might have guessed by his last name, he is related to me. This is my 18-year-old son, currently in his first year at Elon University down in North Carolina. Campbell's also going to serve as our series producer as part of his studies in cinema and television. And so we're very keen to get his Gen Z insight.
Yep, thank you as well for having me. It's a fantastic opportunity. I was going to say, I'm surprised that you wouldn't list me as the most online person. I mean, I don't know how much you're on, but I think
all right.
It's hard to beat the people in my generation in terms of who's the most online.
Well, I think that's probably true, Campbell. And I say that because both of you have me beat, which is why I'm so excited to talk about some of the stuff that came across my my desk this week and try to understand what's going on through the broader lens of both generations and culture. Okay, so first one up. There's a story in the New York Times this morning. We're recording on Monday, March 3rd. There's a story in the New York Times this morning about how Elon Musk's use of online slang is feeling very dated. It cites Doge as a primary example of this. Also his use of epic and based as let's call it dog whistles to a particular kind of very online audience, and then goes into a series of other sort of internet-based rabbit holes. The thing that I thought about this was just that we've reached a tipping point where these things are no longer online slang and they're just slang. But I wonder, am I missing anything here?
I think really quickly is that I think you are right. However, I think that the sort of things that he uses, like I am become meme and Doge in general, are a very specific era of internet that no longer exists. Number one. Number two.
Why doesn't it exist anymore?
Because it's here's a good example. This is sort of to tell another story, but if you know anybody who has a parent who grew up in another country and spoke another language and they sort of taught you that, they are speaking a version of the language from the year that they lived there. So
Sure.
Hypothetically, I have friends who are I speak Portuguese, for example, but it's Portuguese from 1985, meaning all the references, all the slang is outdated. So in a similar way, the sort of internet slang that he's using was late aughts, early 2010s, and it sort of outs you as old in a way. It outs you as an old millennial, and it's not cool. It's also not ironic enough that it works. It just seems outdated, and again, those things that he sort of says weren't really things people were saying. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So this is so you're saying that he's like a Quebecer in France. Quebecois,
Sure, yeah,
the
yeah.
Quebecois French is a version, like an antiquated version of traditional French that moved over with the colonials. And so they call a sweater, for instance, a chemise de laine. This is my favorite thing. A wool shirt.
Yeah,
That's what
yeah.
they call. So, so yeah, my poor former colleagues used to get made fun of in France all the time. Poor guys.
Oh my God.
So it's like that essentially.
Yeah,
You're
yeah,
saying Elon is Quebecois.
I
yeah,
mean,
exactly.
I would also say that I feel like obviously he has a specific sort of emphasis on meme culture.
Hmm.
And this is definitely sort of a joke that I've seen on Twitter a lot. People are calling him President Reddit because he's very clearly a very active user of Reddit. And Reddit attracts a sort of vibe, a sort of kind of person that uses that platform. You know, generally the stereotype is that they're kind of out of touch and that they're tryhards. And so
Hmm.
I think that's representative of him. Obviously, he has a very obviously communicable desire to fit in. And so I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to appeal to the memes and the culture that he saw when he was on Reddit, when
Right.
it was cutting edge in like 2014 or whatever. And now that it's sort of not fallen by the wayside, but it's become less culturally relevant with the rise of stuff like obviously Instagram is much more popular. TikTok has
Right.
exceeded it to a great degree. I feel like he's just sort of stuck in the past. And then also
What?
one
Yeah,
other
Kyle,
thing,
what were you gonna
sorry,
say?
No, keep
just
going, Campbell.
just the way that the internet works is that things are constantly evolving, and so memes by nature evolve. We're at the point where memes have become so mainstream that people are like discussing it as in like phases, like they're elements or they're experiencing like phases like you would see in cinema or literature, something like that.
Yeah, I was going to say that, like, I think a part of it to that exact point is that, like, memes go and fast forward now, and every culture online has their different sort of slang and meme expressions, et cetera, et cetera. And, like, the ones that he's drawing from are neither contemporary nor are there things that are still in use. And I think, like, the thing is that, like, the zones that he's sort of trying to appeal to and sort of exist in, they have their, like, for lack of better words, like, they have their incel speak. It exists and it's contemporary, but he's not
Right.
using that, which is like that would be so much more powerful if he was like speaking, for lack of better words, like Andrew Tate, which he's not. So he looks
Right.
like an idiot. It really outs him
Okay.
as like, you're not as powerful as you say you are. You don't even get this. You're not. And again, like the other point is like the Fortnite thing is like you're a poser. Like none of this is real. You don't actually
Right.
do this shit.
So okay. So it's when I lived in Australia, famously, the worst thing you could be is a tryhard. So essentially, he's outing himself as a tryhard.
Totally.
Yeah.
Okay. So now I understand. Although I feel like I will never be able to catch up, and this podcast will be a constant weekly reminder of the fact that I am always going to be behind.
Here's the thing is that like it's like slang now and like internet speak. And Campbell, if you have a differing opinion, let me know. Slang and online sort of like vernacular is like clothing. It has exceeded sort of fashion trends in that production method. And just like a fashion trend, like if you wear something that's just slightly old or slightly dated, it's an immediate like give versus just being more timeless. And like that's sort of where he's sort of falling into that trap of like he doesn't understand the sort of cultural power that comes with actually knowing like I could spout off a million like sort of queer online things right now, like what the child reading nachos, whatever, and like to certain people that means something.
Sorry, what? Could
But
you please revisit?
It's too much of a rabbit hole. Like not
Millennial slang sort of
yeah,
thing.
it's like
the stuff that had its limelight in like 2011 maybe.
Yeah. But like it's there are things that if he were to say it now, he would seem a bit more with it.
Okay.
But it's still like it would seem like, oh yeah, like dad's wearing baggy jeans and baggy jeans are in.
Mhm. Yeah.
Guilty.
I
It
think
wouldn't seem
also
authentic.
Guilty.
I think also to build on that, your specific mention of the term based dad is really interesting because like based is a term that has is one of the few terms I think that has exceeded like the typical slang sort of like lifespan.
Right. Can I
created
just stop
by
you there for 1 second?
oh
Because
yeah
I just want to point one thing out before you continue, because I want to hear what you said. The New York Times article attributes both epic and based to Joss Whedon and the late
Uh,
90s,
not true.
which I
That's
thought
not
was
true.
also very funny, because even I know
Epic I
that's
could
not right.
see, but no, yeah, both are not right.
Epic maybe, but based
Based
comes
Bass
from
was created by Lil B the
Yeah.
bass god.
That's right. Okay,
That's
so
the
anyway,
truth.
Yeah.
so
Yes,
let's
yes.
get
But like
based here,
that
Campbell.
term,
Yeah,
that
go for it.
term was invented as sort of like a tell-all for just something that's like good or that you agree with, like based in fact is the
Mhm.
idea. And it's supposed to represent, obviously Lil B is a very, very progressive sort of figure, stands in solidarity with a lot of social causes. And because of the way that it sounds, it was sort of cohabited by eventually more right-wing and
Yep.
sort of alt-right figures to become this thing where it's like, oh, he's based, he's red-pilled, and obviously red-pilled in reference to the Matrix. They're saying that that is representative of their values and their beliefs. And so oftentimes when slang does sort of exceed its like lifespan or its expiration date, it's because it takes on new meaning.
Yeah. I get it. I mean, do your friends at school use based?
No.
And is that because it's red pilled?
I mean, because it's very traditionally associated with red pill.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I say it's always ironic that like all of these terms and all of these sort of like philosophical and cultural gestures are sort of thrown around now by the right are just the sort of leftovers or like really old things on the table of like queer, persons of color, XYZ, like talking about the Matrix and taking pills, like this is a metaphor for trans, etc. And you use that now to sort of express that you are, you know, right. It's so ironic.
Obsessed. Well, I mean, anything pilled, right? Is you're obsessed
You're a
with
true American patriot.
Yes.
Well, nice of you to say, Campbell. Thanks. I said the pledge.
There he doesn't get the reference. You don't get the reference there.
Oh
either.
man, I saw a really cool Barbara Kruger piece reciting the Pledge of Allegiance the other day. Takes on a different message when she does it. All right. Well, okay. So that's okay. So thank you for bringing Gen X into the future. Let's move to what's on Gen Y's mind here, Kyle. Like, what you pointed us to a couple of things I want to understand better because I don't.
So I think the one big thing, which I think sort of this carousel goes around every so often, and I'm very intrigued to get both of your take, is there has been a sort of, since the election and what happened with the election, at least on TikTok, and at least a specific corner of TikTok, there's been this sort of like ongoing conversation of like, you know what, maybe millennials were the best generation. Maybe millennials did get blah, blah, blah right. And it's not being said by millennials. Millennials are then like responding to that and being like, yeah, like XYZ. A good example now is people are like, going to the club sucks. Nobody goes to the club. And like Gen Z people saying that, younger people saying that. And the sort of counterbalance to that is like millennial voices saying like, yeah, we didn't care about how stupid we looked. We also didn't have any money.
Right.
And like we were just trying to get by. And this is where we went to sort of let it all go and not try to like put on any airs. It's just where we sort of let loose. And as a result of that is one part of this conversation is a sort of like, oh, like they're not giving a fuck. Millennials, that is, they're not giving a fuck in tough times to sort of led them to be able to be, say, more accepting and forward thinking and maybe less regressive in some ways. And not that like millennials or below or above or a monolith either, but like it's something I think that there has been some soul searching, let's say, post-election. And like I think people, the conversation is coming back at least a second time since then of like, what are millennials cooking with? Because like we need to look at that recipe and maybe think about it. So I'm sort of curious about what like both of you think, because like I think like, yeah, finally people are catching up. But on the other end, it's like, you know, I don't even think it matters. It's just another version of the like millennials wear mom jeans. It's like, it doesn't matter.
So okay, so let's do some grounding, right? Because we didn't explain this perfectly. I am a very young, or maybe not very young, but pretty young Gen X. Campbell, you're sort of mid,
I would say mid Gen Z.
mid Gen Z, and then Kyle,
What would you say, when was the end of Gen Z? What was the cutoff? Like 2012, maybe? That was when Gen A started?
I
Yeah,
think
something
it's
like that.
Yeah, somewhere in that territory.
I thought it was a little older than that, maybe more.
Let's look
closer
it
to
up. I'll look it
2015.
up really quickly.
All right, well, Kyle,
I'd hedge bet say 2012.
2012. Okay, good.
Yeah,
So, and
2012.
then Kyle, where do you situate yourself on the?
I
on
am
the,
like exact in the middle of millennial. I'm
Okay,
like
got it.
86, so like I'm not. I think it started in 80 and ended in 95, so I'm like
Yep.
right in the middle.
Got it. Okay, so we've got a young X, a young Z, and a mid millennial here. All right, so.
But wait, Ben,
Campbell,
you wouldn't call yourself a zillennial, would you? No. X.
me?
Well, okay, we. Yeah, I was gonna
X2
say.
millennial.
Yeah. No.
No.
So you're just a little bit.
Zillennial.
Yeah.
Oh, and
So
I sorry. I'm only used to zillennial with a Z, not
Yeah.
the
Well,
With an
not
X,
the
like
Kyle.
Catalan
xylophone.
spelling.
yeah.
The
You don't think you're like on that shoulder? You think you're just like
no,
outside of the
no,
shoulder?
no.
Okay.
I no. I have a younger brother, born in '78, and he
Oh.
has at various times claimed as the what's that video game, the famous video game where you died of dysentery?
Oregon Trail.
Oregon Trail. They call themselves the Oregon Trail generation, like some sort of
Yes.
mini generation.
That's a very
No.
specific moment. It's true. That is, I think, zillennial culture for
Yeah,
sure.
fair enough. Okay,
Anyway.
got it. All right.
And
So
keep going,
anyway,
sorry.
Campbell, so talk about that. Are millennials the greatest generation? Kyle has thrown down the gauntlet.
I mean, I think it's very difficult because I feel like your point about not really giving a shit and not caring how you look sort of, I think, is relative to the general sort of outlook and attitude that's sort of present. I feel like this may not be the outlook that a lot of people had then, but I feel like when you were growing up, Dad, there were a lot of people who were very sort of checked out, obviously around like the 90s, you had the rise of sort of like a slacker mentality.
Mhm.
You have stuff where life seemed like we're past the point where we're in the 50s to 60s to whatever, like golden age. And now we're getting to the point where Gen Z is becoming adults. They're looking back at the culture that was produced then and seeing the attitude that it has. And you're thinking, wow, these people didn't really have that much to complain about. Like, they could afford houses. College was still excessively expensive, but not as expensive. But then you take a step back and you think about stuff like the looming existential threat of something like the Cold War. Like, obviously, the threat of being blown up is not something that you like to think about. That was something that's sort of omnipresent in the mindset, in the zeitgeist, if you will. But like, the attitude that I think Gen Z has is that there are a lot of people who really don't care anymore, which is really sad because they're still young. But there are people who are they're sort of starting to realize that we're getting to a sort of weird sticking point in history where everything is more advanced than it's ever been, but almost because of that, everything is sort of worse. Like, obviously, we have the capacity to communicate. We have the capacity to communicate with almost anyone across the world, but phones and the internet has made a lot of people lonelier than they've ever been. You have
that's a good point.
Stuff like recreational cannabis use that's been legalized, but that's leading a lot of people to sort of just like shutting in and not really taking in the world, just sort of becoming almost slaves to their vices. I feel like the thing about millennials is that obviously with my generation, they have a sort of like cringe like reputation because of all the stupid stuff that they might have done, like the wholesome memes or whatever. But like, they had an attitude where they were coming into a world that was new and that was their own, and they were ready to face it, and they were ready to face the music. I feel like a lot of Gen Z people have sort of become despondent, and they don't really care. They don't think they can do anything or rise above or sort of even change the system. And so they're just
Yeah.
content with living in this sort of like in between state.
I think it's okay. So my take on it all, right, is that everything is relative, and that when I was your age, Campbell, people felt very worried and also very excited about what would happen. They, to your point, there was the threat of the Cold War by that time had sort of dissipated, but we had grown up with it, and we're very aware of these existential threats. By the same token, the internet was just starting, and so there was this world of possibility and communication that was opening up. I think these things just go in stages, and I thought, Kyle, the story that you put in about the millennial redemption arc in this week's embedded newsletter was an interesting one, because it reminded me of how over the course of time I have reassessed my life, my generation, the wisdom of any of it, and so on and so forth. And it reminds me of, like, we grew up in a way where the worst thing you could do in America, in indie culture and the spaces I came out of, was to sell out. Like, it was the worst thing you could do. And I think the interesting thing is, over the course of time, that association has gone away, for better or for worse. But you now get into a scenario where, instead of the rappers, as we've talked about, like, making the songs for the liquor companies, they now own the liquor companies, right? Like that would have been seen to be an artistic never no zone before, but now it's an obvious place to operate.
Well, it's funny. I mean, it's funny you say that, because I feel like that's like sort of perhaps the appeal, say, of what millennialness is that, like, I think to your point, like Gen X was very like, not going to sell out, whatever, very authentic in that way, which is very good, very great.
Well,
like,
I mean, up until a point, right?
Yeah, to a point, yes. But like, there's a lot to respect in that. On the other end, there is so much of Gen Z, which is almost the opposite of that, to the point of, like, I think, Campbell, you said it, it's sort of like despondence and sort of like checking out. A lot of that is like, here's a good example, is like, the world's going to end, things suck, I'm going to make as much money as possible, fuck it, whatever. And like, that's the opposite of the sort of Gen X attitude.
Yeah, sure.
So millennials somehow, as a result of the context that we've been in, land somewhere in the middle, where we're able to sort of like take a bit of both of those. And I'm not saying everybody does it right. I'm not saying that's unique to everybody, but I do think there's a bit of a, like, being able to navigate those spaces without it being so soulless, if that makes sense. Like, I think that's like taking the best of it and like really recognizing it for what it is and working with it, versus being like, this sucks, fuck it. Instead being like, okay, like, I need to make this work. I need to survive. I think that's really where a lot of the millennial attitude comes from, is like mode of survival.
Sure.
Which is interesting.
I think it's what I find interesting about that is that the way you couch it as a mode of pragmatic survival driven behavior, like, all of that tracks with me, because it's I think what you realize over time is that that's kind of how everybody behaves. But there are all of these trappings that get associated with millennial lifestyle that are not involved with survival at all, right?
Yeah.
Like Instagrammable avocado toast and, squiggly furniture and that kind of stuff. Like, there's no survival necessary, in those things. And so I think it's the reckoning is probably figuring out which of those things were actually good and beneficial and necessary, and which of those were just superficial aesthetic.
Totally.
I mean, I'd also say that I think, as you sort of touched on, Kyle, for a lot of people in Gen Z, the attitude really is like, I'm going to chase the bag. I'm going to get my bread, to use the term.
And that's a cringe millennialism, isn't it?
Well, we're bridging the gap here, okay?
Okay, got
This is for the benefit of the audience.
Okay,
I
got it.
would never say that in my regular life. But the point is that, like, I've seen people who are bragging about drop shipping, and there are people who are like posting on Instagram about how they're scamming, like they're scamming people, and
Right.
that's their main way of making money. I saw a video where a guy was talking about how he made like $200,000 a year. He used to be a video editor for some like high tier streamer YouTuber, and he was talking about how he makes like 200,000 a year on TikTok by getting AI to literally just edit videos for him. Like he does no work, and he's bragging about that. Like from the mindset of someone who's in Gen X, that's like you're completely compromising your morals or your artistic integrity, whatever it may be, primarily editing, just so that you can get money.
Right.
And his view is, I don't care. I'm making 200,000 a year. Most of the people that I knew who were coming out of college the same time as me are in massive debt, and they're barely scraping by with like 80,000 a year.
Right.
So I
Sure.
think the attitude, and this connects back to the whole despondency. It's like we're living in a, people love to say that we're living in a post whatever word it was, postmodern, post-consumerist, stuff like that. So they like to think about everything as so messed up because it allows them to sort of detach themselves from reality and say, what I'm doing, no matter what you think of it, is justified because I'm successful in what I do.
Right. What?
I was going to say, like, I feel like, so it's, I love and hate the generational conversations because I think specifically this type, because
This is
it's
gonna be a
something
fun
where
podcast.
it's like, well, because it's because I think like exactly what you mentioned, Campbell, of like somebody young being like, fuck it, I'm making $200,000, even though it's maybe ethically wrong. I think that that is just maybe something that like a 21-year-old just does any generation. Like I think a lot of these things that we talk about as unique to a generation, just unique to somebody at X point in life, and we're trying to brand it,
Right.
which is fine. I think the difference is, granted, the technology wasn't available, but like the difference is the different generations didn't talk about it or share it or sort of like gloat about it. That I think is different because like I think
Yeah.
Caroline Calloway is a good example. I'm like, what's her name?
Anna Delvey?
Anna Delvey is a perfect example of like that. Like it's the same thing, but like it was done in the millennial way, and like it's the same
Sure.
end result, same whatever. But like even with like the squiggly couches, like I'm sure there was a Gen X squiggly couch or an avocado toast, but like you didn't have Instagram, so maybe it was the Polaroid
Yeah.
of like your Zima. I don't know. I'm making that up, but like
I
there's.
mean, you're not wrong.
But there's,
You're
but
not
again,
wrong.
it's like a lot of these things I think are just like they're unique to being at a specific age in life that get sort of bundled up as XYZ generation, which is why I think like, you know, fighting about skinny jeans is just stupid. It's like, well, we all have worn jeans at a specific time, and I made fun of my parents, and now you're making fun of me. Like, who gives a shit? It's just life. But
Yeah.
that doesn't make
well,
money.
look, I think that's the idea. I mean, to me, that's what's exciting about this conversation happening on a weekly basis is trying to get to where the shared territory is, and also where the points of radical difference are, and then also the places that seem radically different now but are going to come back in and
Totally.
and seem together later. All right, so Campbell, we've left your story till last, but I wanted to understand. So you forwarded us a story here from Capital Mom, who is by the look of things,
CapitalMomNebraska.com, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
She's not just a capital mom. She's a mom in Nebraska.
Would you please explain how you found this link?
I mean, firstly, I just have to give some props to the moms in Nebraska. They're holding it down, you know, working hard.
Oh my God.
But my reasoning for including that is because it's a story written by a grandma, and she's talking about like the disparity in the types of music that she listened to versus the types that her grandchildren listen to. That
Right.
I think the article is pretty dated because it mentions Macklemore, who no offense, I don't think has been relevant since, what was it,
Oh,
2015
well,
when he
yeah,
won the
this is
Grammy?
written in 2016.
Sure.
How did you find an article from 2016 from Capital Mom, Nebraska? Where did this come from?
Google.
Okay.
Let
But
me
it's,
let me
oh
I
yeah,
would
go
have
Can
ahead.
I
asked
say
ChatGPT.
one thing really quickly about Macklemore? I have not listened to any of Macklemore's music ever, but I will say he does occasionally trend like once or twice a year because he will drop some random fucking song where he's like, fuck, for example, he's like, fuck Israel, Palestine forever. You guys are like genocidal maniacs. Like he'll just drop this amazing, like really good politics stuff. I don't listen to it, but like people talk about it
Yeah,
because
yeah, sure.
anyway, just clearing
Okay, so
Macklemore's
Kyle,
name for a
that actually,
second.
that returns us for a second to the top. Is Macklemore in that instance then doing the thing that Elon Musk is trying to do, but doing it successfully?
Yeah, because he's doing it sincerely.
And he's
Because he,
doing it in his own way. Yeah.
yeah, he
Yeah.
believe
Okay.
the thing that Elon Musk fails to do is that he doesn't believe that. Like there was the whole thing about the controversy recently about like the H-1B visas, where it's like they're
Mm-hmm.
having immigrant workers come in and supplement the tech industry instead of hiring domestically. Elon Musk came in to say, we need to help America, we need to raise the birth rate, we need to do X, Y, and Z, but he doesn't really believe in that. He wants
Mm-hmm.
what's best for him and what's best for the billionaire class.
Sure.
He doesn't want what's good for the comp sci majors who are coming out with massive student debt expecting to make bank, but they can't find a job.
Right. Well, look, good illustration of the fact that nothing is guaranteed and what best laid
Totally.
plans don't always work out anyway. But
Main lesson is don't do comp sci. Don't do comp
I'm
sci.
not sure
Fair.
that is the main lesson. Actually, I'm not sure that is the main lesson.
My roommate took one comp sci class and he said it was the hardest class he's ever taken ever.
I mean, doing hard things is not that's not bad.
It's not bad, but
All right. Well, we'll
That's
talk
what
about
I'll-
this
I'll
conversation.
let the comp sci majors do the comp sci work. I'll do
Okay.
my work.
Fine, fair
But
enough.
to
You're
return
gonna
to
edit,
the
you're going to edit on AI and
yeah,
make $200,000 a year, right?
yep,
Oh my God.
All right,
I'm gonna
perfect.
chase the
Love
bag.
that. Starting
But
with this podcast.
just to return back to the article, the thing that I found interesting about it and why I thought it was relevant is that it's like it's talking about music specifically as a bridge between generations, and I think that music is probably the strongest bridge between generations. Like especially with the
That's
internet nowadays, there are bands and groups that maybe even were, you know, very contemporary in their time and very relevant because of how they influenced genres and norms and stuff like that, but they didn't get appreciation. And now, because we have so much like media fragmentation and we have the sort of internet cult following, these bands are getting recognized now because of the importance that they had back then that they weren't recognized for.
Right. Yeah. Shout out Petula Clark, whose song "Downtown" was the impetus for this contribution from Capital Mom, Nebraska.
For real.
I mean, I agree. Like, I do think music is a good sort of, let's say, icebreaker as far as like generational conversations. I think it's funny now, though, to sort of like talk about the idea of like sampling and like interpolations of, say, older music, because like this sort of the sort of life cycle of that has gotten to this point where like the samples are now like 2 years old, and it's like, wait, what? So like that's a funny thing because like it's I think the Macklemore example is a really good one because like that was something that really was calling something back, and now like a lot of the callbacks are like not that old. So like I think it sort of defeats the creativity. Like you don't get it in some ways if it's just such a recent sampling, and like it's a lot of them are not interesting as a result. It's just sort of like, well, this was famous 5 years ago. I'm just going to redo it. Like, sure.
Sure.
But anyway, that like I think is I'm curious if that specific example happens as much anymore because people often don't even recognize a reference.
Yeah. I wonder to what extent we have gotten lost in reference soup to the degree that it doesn't matter anymore. Whereas, Kyle, to your point, the references that we grew up on were intended in some way to place a listener within a certain context or to educate them on a previous moment. Whereas now it's just what's the sample that's at hand, or what's the easiest thing, or what can you buy on YouTube for $100 a beat. Shout out Charlie.
Shout out CG Beats. You got to use the alias.
CG Beats.
Yeah.
Shout out CG Beats on YouTube.
I think just to build on that, I feel like the whole thing about reference culture is also really fascinating, because it's sort of like there's a video I saw recently that was talking about how, especially in cinema, we're constantly retreading things. Like, there was one original Jurassic Park movie, and there have been, I think, net 5 or 6 sequels, and there's another one that's supposed to be coming out. And I don't think anyone has ever come to the consensus that any of those sequels were at all superior artistically to the original. So what's the point? It's money. Like, a perfect example is
Dinosaurs are cool, though.
They are cool. But a perfect example is like Treehouse of Horror in The Simpsons. Like, I remember a couple years ago they did a Treehouse of Simpsons episode. It was like 2019, where they were spoofing Stranger Things, and they were 3 years late on a reference on a show that had its heyday 20 years ago, referencing a show that's all about referencing and paying homage to art from the 80s, and it wasn't even a good reference. Like, it sucked. I'm sorry to say this, Simpsons Treehouse of Horror, whatever, head writer, if you're somehow hearing this, it sucked. It was bad. And it's like we're so sort of addicted to, especially in media, to the sort of style over substance aspect, where we love going back to these things that worked, and we don't realize why they worked is the reason why they're not going to work now.
I was just going to say, that brings us back to Elon Musk. It's exactly the same thing. It's a danger. It's like, again, the references are like a double-edged sword. And I think, to the point of, yes, I think like a place that we really see this come alive a lot is like in fashion, where like references, now everything's just sort of like jumbled, which is great, but also bad. It's like, you're not necessarily, not that you need to know the history or the context of a specific garment to wear it. That's not what I'm saying. But I think there's sort of like a good example. I don't have a specific example. Like, a good example is like when Shein rips off a varsity jacket, let's say. Something that is, if you don't have like a little bit of sort of cultural knowledge, that's a very obvious one, but like, if you don't think like, oh shit, like they're probably at any vintage store on eBay, hundreds and hundreds and thousands of varsity jackets that I could get for $5. First, and it's authentic, made of leather, whatever, versus $5 some plastic piece of shit that was made by people who are not getting paid at all. And like, so it's that sort of understanding of the references that like is sort of key, because that's where you sort of get into the sort of dangerous territory, is if you don't know the reference. Not that you need to, but like, it just, you're doing more work and you're contributing to a system that you don't necessarily want to.
Right. You run the risk of making a mistake of, omission or lack of information, which is the reason, guys, that I asked you to come together and have this conversation and to help me with my hip replacement.
Yeah. Replace your hips.
Listen, we'll be back for another episode next week. But in the meantime, I want to thank our guest and our in-house producer, Campbell Dietz, representing Gen Z. Thanks very much.
Go team.
And as always, thanks for joining me and Kyle, your hosts, in hip replacement.
Thanks, y'all.
Next week.
Thank you, everybody.